Welcome to the tutorial Optimizing the Skeleton. So in this tutorial, we're going to go over setting up the pivots, setting up the rest position, and setting up the zones of influence. If you remember from the last tutorial, we finished rigging our character here, but there were a few body parts that did not receive any type of a deformer, such as the tail, the hands, the head, and the facial features of the karate rabbit. So any part that did receive a deformation rig, such as the ears, the limbs, the body, etc., will automatically rotate from the root of their deformation rig. However, these other drawings that did not receive a deformer need to have their pivots set. Because this character was formerly used as a cutout puppet, I believe all the pivots are set correctly in place, but I will go over how to set up a pivot really quickly just in case you don't know how. So I'm going to select the hand in the camera view with the transform tool, and we can see, if we zoom in, that the pivot looks to be in the correct position here at the wrist. This is exactly where we would rotate the hand from. So let's look for the hand here in the timeline view, and here it is. And I'm going to select this tool here called the pivot tool, and we can see some of its tool properties if we toggle to this tab. And let's say that I drew this hand from scratch and the pivot was in some strange place. Usually I think it's at the center of the drawing like that, but we don't want to rotate from the center of the hand. So I'm going to place this one on the wrist. So you can drag it where you want or click to position it like this. So I think that looks pretty good, but the problem is that this view has multiple drawings. If we scroll across, you'll see that there are other positions for the hands. And if you think about it, you really need the pivot to be in the identical place for all the different hand positions for the same view. And that's because as we're animating, if we change the hand position and the pivot's not in the right place, it'll pop a bit. It'll kind of jerk to one side or to the other side to center where the pivot is. So we definitely don't want that. So the way that you can ensure that the pivot is placed in the exact same position for all the hands of the same view, and that's by right-clicking on this cell with the pivots tool still selected from the toolbar, and selecting copy cells from timeline, or you can use Command or Control C, so it's just like a regular copy. And then you can select the other drawings, which are these two right here, so you can hold down Shift to select the other two, right click on them and say Paste Special. Then from the Paste Special window, if you go to the Advanced tab, you can select Update Drawing Pivot and say OK or hit Enter to validate your change. And now if you scroll across, you can see that the pivot is set in the identical place for all three drawings. So I'm just going to undo that. If we back out a little bit here, I can show you where all your pivots are supposed to be. So for the hands, obviously it's the wrist. For the tail, it's obviously the tip of the tail. For the head, it's down here sort of where the teeth are, so it's actually by the neck. For the nose, obviously the center, mouth center, same for the eyes, and I would also say the eyebrows. So those are the ones that you will probably have to set. So the next thing we have to go over is how to set up the rest position for our deformation skeletons. If you remember, we drew or created the rig very quickly and some of the positioning was not optimal, I would say. So we're going to go through all the body parts one at a time using the setup mode and the transform tool to set up the position, and then using the copy resting position to current to set those positions as the rest positions. So let's start with the ears. So I'll just go from top down. I'm going to select this in the camera view with the transform tool, find it in the timeline. You can select it here in the timeline, or obviously you can select it here in the network view. So I'm going to turn on the setup mode, and I'm going to go to the view menu and select show controls, and also use the show control here. Oh, and I think you have to be sure you're on the deformation group and not just the drawing. So let's show control again, and there we see it. So the fact that we see the deformer in red, the controls for the deformer in red, is a good sign. If you see it in green, it's active and it's ready to animate. If you see it in red, it's sort of like stop or setup mode. So I actually think this deformer is not so bad, So I might just leave that one the way it is actually. It's pretty good. Let's look at the other ear. I would say that's not too bad either. Oh, and we should actually check the deformer for all three views, obviously. So this view, it changes for this view. Okay, here some setting up could be done. So I'm just going to show selected deformer and hide all others. So right now we're working with this ear right here. I'm going to use the transform tool to actually take the root and bring it down closer to the head. And then I'm going to use this square and bring it up to the edge of the ear. Maybe I'll even pull this out a little bit. So that's good. So now if we show all deformers, which is this one right here, you can see that the green active view and our setup mode are not the same, and that's not what we want. We want them to be the same. So what I'm going to do is turn off the show all manipulators mode, and I'm going to be sure that the deformation group is selected. So not just this deformer, but the entire group. And actually I'm going to do that in the network view just to be safe. So I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut O to find our deformer group, zoom in, and yes, we can see it's selected, so that's perfect. And then what we're going to do is click on this button here, copy resting position to current. And now if we go back to the show all manipulators mode, you can see that the green rests exactly on top of the red. So if we're out of setup mode, we see the green, and if we're in setup mode, we see the red, and they are identically positioned. So I'm going to continue doing that for all the views, for all the deformation groups, and I might speed up this part of the video once again because it is a repetitive process. Okay, so I'm going to slow down a little bit here for the body deformation rig just because it's a bit more of a special case. You'll see as I start adjusting the rig with the transform tool with the setup mode on, something weird's going to start to happen. You're going to see these pieces move around, and I don't want you to get freaked out because as soon as we click on the copy resting position to current button, everything will right itself. So don't worry too much about that. And the reason this is happening is because if we go into the body deformation group and we click on any one of these kinematic groups that we created, such as the body hip group, for example, and we go into its layer properties, we can see that the output kinematic chain is set to use parent composites connected element exposure, and that's the reason that all those body parts are moving around. But not to worry, like I said. So I'm just going to make my regular adjustments and you'll see it all right itself in just a minute. So now look, as I click on copy resting position to current button, everything is righted itself and we are okay. And you may have also noticed that I expanded the radius of this circle here, and that's to touch the edges of the width of the body, and that's an important adjustment to make. Okay, so now that we're finished setting up the rest position for our cartoon character, we're going to discuss the zones of influence. So the zones of influence are basically used to increase the accuracy of the deformation effect on the artwork. It has the power, the zone of influence, to shape the art contained within it, as well as influence the area of its children's elements. So for example, we can manipulate the entire leg by selecting the deformation group for that chain, or we can select the individual bones and articulations in that group to manipulate sections of the artwork of this leg. So a good way to test to see if the influence zones are working well is to actually move your character around. So I'm going to get out of the setup mode and I'm going to show all controllers. So you actually have to select the group first and then use Command F11 on Mac, and that's Shift F11 on Windows. So now we can see the controls for the body here because we had the body deformation group selected. And then what I'm going to do is I'll put the animate mode on so we can create a keyframe. And if I do this, you can see that it's moving pretty nicely. And I grabbed the chest bone here, so that's why we're moving from the chest bone. I'm going to undo that. If we zoom in a little bit here, we can also try rotating the neck. And if you see here, we have a little bit of a problem with the neck because the collar gets warped in a pretty strange way. So I realized this afterwards. Because the collar is somewhat unusual, the neck piece comes down into the collar instead of there being like a flush cut or round cut, in which is a pretty obvious divide between shirt and neck. So for stretching, it's really not so bad, but it's really this rotation where the collar gets warped. So one way to resolve this is actually to cut the neck out and put it on its own layer and give it its own deformation chain. So that's probably the best way to go. However, another thing that we could try is adjusting its zone of influence. So let's go to the network view and let's look for our neck, which we know is up here at the top in the body group. Let's go inside the body group and let's go into the front view. And this right here is the neck, because as you recall, we started at the bottom. So that was the root. We had the pelvic bone, the belly button, the chest bone, this rotation piece that's where the neck rotates from, and the neck bone itself. So to display its zone of influence, the first thing we have to do is enter its layer properties. Once again, you can enter the layer properties for this specific bone deformer by clicking on the yellow square on the module, but as you can see, it's exactly the same thing that you would see in the layer properties. And what we can do is change its influence type. Right now, all the influence types are set to infinite, and generally for a cutout puppet with a deformation rig, this is what's recommended. But we're going to try some different options here. So let's select elliptic from the drop down, and to see the zone in the camera view, we have to select this button here, show all zones of influence. And so as you can see, it's actually quite large for an ellipse. I actually thought it would be going the other way, so sort of like this, but it's actually much wider than it is tall. And we can also see that it is taking in the pixels of the collar. So right away we know that maybe, possibly, if we pare this ellipse down a little bit, we might have a more accurate zone of influence. So the first thing we can do is look at the transversal radius and the longitudinal radius. So right now they're symmetric, which means if I use the left and the begin radius, I should be able to affect both sides. So let's see if we bring them down a bit. If we can start to get something closer to what we want. Okay, I'm going to zoom in here because the worst thing to do actually is to exclude some pixels. So right now we're really excluding pixels as well. So I'm going to raise this a little bit to make sure at least that we include everything. So it's better to have a little bit more than a little bit less. And then I might increase so I was wrong. When you're using the symmetric ellipse of influence, it's the end and not the beginning radius that you use to change both this top part and this bottom part simultaneously. So this we can bring back down to, I think it was like 2 or 2.5. And this I'm just going to try to bring as close as I can to the collar without going too much over or too much under. So I'm missing a bit of the neck here. But I'm pretty sure it's being taken care of by the zone of influence for the neck articulation here. So let's try again. So the first thing we have to do now that we have changed the zone of influence is click on the copy resting position to current again. So anytime that you make a change to either the rig or the zones of influence, you have to click on this button. So now if we zoom out, I'm just going to hide the zone of influence for a minute. And we rotate, what do we see? Okay, so it's doing pretty much the same thing. It hasn't changed too much. So maybe we can take a look at the zone of influence around this articulation here, which is now being highlighted. So we're going to also turn this one into an elliptic zone of influence, and we're going to show the zones of influence again. Okay, so this one is definitely taking in the collar. And once again, we'd like this to be as small as possible and just basically be influencing the neck. So before I was using these up and down arrow keys in the layer properties panel, but this time I'm going to use the handle here. So because it's a symmetric ellipse, I only see one blue handle. If it was asymmetric, I would actually see two. I would see one on either side. So I'm going to grab this. So I'm going to turn off the animate button. And I should be in setup mode, actually. I should have been in setup mode for the other one, so I hope I was. And if I wasn't, just to let you know, you should be in setup mode when you're fixing your zones of influence. So maybe something like that. And let's try this again. So let's make sure this is selected. Click on the convert button. We're going to hide our zones of influence. We're going to get out of the setup mode and we're going to rotate the neck again. So it's not doing a super great job still. So we can try two more things. I'm going to undo that. What I'm going to do is look at the zone of influence for the neck bone again. So we're looking at this one right here. And this time what we're going to do is we're going to convert this ellipse into a shape. And we do this by clicking on this button here, Convert Ellipse. So if we didn't have an ellipse shape selected and we had selected shaped automatically from this drop down, we would have seen a rectangular zone here. But because it was an ellipse first and then we converted it, we now have a bunch of points and Bezier handles around this ellipse. So I'm going to zoom in. And now we're going to make this zone even more precise to the neck. And actually what I'm going to do is take this influence and make it infinite again, just so that I can see better as I'm shaping the zone of influence for the neck. Right, so I have to make sure I'm in the setup mode first, which is helpful. I'm going to try to make this into a V or a point. And what you can do to break your handles so that they don't tilt with one another like this is hold down Alt as you grab the handle, and it'll break it, so that you can make a sharp bend. Okay, so I'm just going to check one thing. Okay, right, so I forgot that the head is covering part of the neck, and we do want all of the neck. So let me just bring this up here to cover this knob at the end of the neck. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'm just going to bring the head back. And so what we're going to do is make sure that this neck bone is selected, copy resting position to current. Then I'm going to hide the zones of influence, get out of setup mode, go back to the neck articulation, and right now it's at infinite, so it's really influencing everything around here. Sort of at a block, it stops here and it stops here, but it'll influence everything to the right and left of it. Let's change that to 0 so that it doesn't influence anything. And now let's try moving this again. So still not a great improvement. Let's try bringing this back to elliptic and see if that changes much. So it changes a bit, but still not great. So there's one more thing we can try, and that's changing the influence fade radius for these articulation and bones. So I'm going to select the neck bone again, and what the influence fade radius is even though we've defined these zones, they affect more than just the artwork that exists inside them. They actually affect, to a certain distance, the artwork that exists to the exterior of their boundaries. And depending how high or low this number is, that influences the strength of their pull on the artwork just outside of their boundaries. So obviously the higher this number is, the more they pull at the artwork around them, and the lower it is, the less they pull. So let's try lowering this to something like 0.1. I'm going to hide the zones again, and then let's try rotating. So you can see it pulls a little bit less, which isn't bad. Maybe we can do the same thing for the articulation here, so the neck bone. And then try pulling again. Oh, so it's gotten even better, so it's not so bad. Another thing that we can take a look at is actually the switch, because the influence fade radius, if you remember, can not only be modified from the layer properties of the individual deformer module, but also from the switch. So we'll go inside there and we'll take a look. So right now, this fade exponent is at 3. So if we change it to 1, it becomes a linear type of fade. So let's try that now. So I would say it's about the same. I don't think too much has changed there. The other thing that you can control from the switch is that you can have the fade inside the zone. So like I said, that the fade occurs outside of the defined shape or elliptic zone, but if you check this, then it'll actually occur inside the zone. So still about the same, but actually I think I know why that might be. Because we're dealing with a cutout puppet with multiple poses that's been rigged with deformers, what we really have to look at is the switch, not just for the front pose, but for the switch that controls all the poses, and that exists out here in the deformation body group. So we're going to take a look at this switch right here and also change the exponent to 1 and see if that changes anything. So once again, not much. And let's also try the fade in from this switch over here. I think it might almost be worse doing it that way. So we might uncheck that. So the last thing I might try before taking out this neck, cutting it out, and putting it on its own drawing layer and giving it its own deformer, you could actually convert the zone of influence for this bone, the chest bone, also to shape, and really just outline the collar and the rest of the body very precisely. So that might be one more thing you could try, and if that doesn't work, I would really just take this neck and put it on a different drawing layer. And once again, a lot of this is a bit of trial and error because every character is different. There isn't ever one way. Your character might look nothing like this karate rabbit and have its own intricacies that you need to deal with really on a case-by-case level. So anyway, that's it for the tutorial, Optimizing the Skeleton. Stay tuned for the next tutorial, Storing Your Character in the Library.